This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello and welcome back. I hope you're all fed and watered after your lunch. I'm glad to see so many of you stayed with us today. This session is on digital health, examining Europe's next steps in unleashing a health data economy. I'm Ashley Furlong, and I'm joined here by a stellar panel to dig into how the bloc can actually use its vast troves of health data and use it in a way that protects patients and helps them. The European health data space has made big promises, but like many European projects, it's got to get through a very tricky process with the Parliament and Council tweaking and altering it. Hopefully today we'll examine what the proposal could actually do for patients, researchers, as well as industry, and what, in the opinion of my panelists, needs to change to make it work for these players. With me today in person, I have Jelena Malinina, Data Director at Eurodis. Welcome, Jelena.
Thank you.
We have Susanna Solis, MEP from Renew Europe, and Susanna is also the Shadow Rapporteur for the EHDS, so she's the person to go corner later. And next to her we have Francesco Buonarroti, Information Technology Vice President and Chief Information Officer for Digital Health at Janssen. And online we have Martin Durazel, Deputy Head of Unit of Digital Health at DG Santé. I want to sort of start with speaking about who we're actually doing this for, and that's obviously the patients. Jelena, you represent rare disease patients, and the health data space could be really game-changing for them. But there are also, risks as well with the health data space. And I wanted to maybe ask you, what's the biggest opportunity for the health data space, and then maybe also the biggest threat?
Yeah, I think the opportunities are plenty, actually. So one of them is linked with the establishment of the common standard for the European electronic health record. For rare disease patients, it means that they could travel easier with their data, because very, very often they need to seek care in another country. As you might know, there is the European Reference Networks has been established for some years now, so it could significantly improve daily life of patients and people living with rare disease. When it comes to risks, probably you would want me to say privacy risks, but for sure, yes. But the risks go beyond privacy too. So there are new types of risks, which are informational risks, such as discrimination, profiling, and all sorts of biases, which can be replicated thanks to the new uses of AI. So I think that would be it.
Thanks, Jelena. We're going to get into some of that later, but I wanted to ask Francesco, looking at the proposal as it is now, what do you think your organization would be able to do that it couldn't do previously if this was, passed tomorrow?
Well, first of all, to the opportunity, I think what we see today is an unprecedented convergence of science and technology that we didn't have before. So we had the discipline of science, which is all of science, and we had technology, and the paths are crossing. And this gives us to a company, to the industry, to the researcher, to the academic, completely new tools to face diseases and find therapies for that. That's what it fundamentally is, and which is the opportunity. I think when we look at it, I think we welcome the approach in Europe. It's not that, I think, comparing to other parts of the world, we are running behind. And that's one of the why it's so urgent to do that, because it's happening. It's not that it's not happening in the other part of the world. I think we have still to solve together with that few things, because when the European health data space will give us certainties which are the access rule for primary and secondary type of data, which is the rule of engagement, why we can do that. But still, I think we have to address some other topic like data fragmentation and also data standards. For people that work in the space, knows how much work it is to make registry from different countries speak to each other and make sense out of it. And not to forget that, I mean, given the speed of innovation that we have today, we see a lot of legislation come in the European Union. And so we have here we speak about the AHDS, but together with we have the Data Act, we have the Artificial Intelligence Act, we have the Data Governance Act. When we are going to implement this in country, the interplay has to be clear, otherwise we risk not to solve what we could solve.
I was going to get onto the interplay a bit later, but you mentioned Europe is running behind in some ways, but also obviously many European countries this is quite this is way beyond what they're actually able to do, and I'm wondering, Susanna, how countries who might be really far behind are now looking at this proposal and saying, I don't know how we're actually going to do this by 2025. Should they be given a little bit of leeway, and should we be saying, well, if you can't do it, we give you some extra years to catch up?
As my colleagues mentioned, the opportunity is huge, and I think the best news is that there is a consensus among all the stakeholders that the ambition is huge regarding the scope, regarding the timing, as you mentioned, to have this prepared by 2025 or in 2025. But there is a consensus that it's needed, and we will not reduce the ambition. No? This is important, although there are many difficulties, and for sure, we have to make sure that is something that the Parliament will be very concerned, that the 27 member states benefit from this European health data space. This is very important for us. And we have to overcome a lot of barriers, data fragmentation, interoperability, the different approaches of different health systems in the member states. For example, I come from Spain, where we have a decentralized system. But if we want this regulation to be successful, we have to work on building trust. And for me, building trust is the first thing we have to do in order the citizens trust this regulation. And we have to make clear the benefits for citizens, for rare diseases. They give hope to people suffering from rare diseases and cancer, for the industry, but also for the future. So building trust is essential, and we have to make clear what is the purpose of the regulation, what are the benefits, and how the data will be used. That is why in the Parliament, as you know, there are two committees dealing with this regulation, the Liberty Committees, which is more focused on the privacy and all the human rights, and of course the Environmental and Health Committee, where we should focus that all member states can benefit, all citizens, and also it is the opportunity for Europe to flourish in research and innovation. I think we are very brave with this regulation, and it is important.
Thanks, Susanna. My next question was actually about trust, but before that I wanted to bring in Martin on the sort of mandatory issue, and to ask him, when you were coming up with the proposal, how did you decide what should you make mandatory, what shouldn't you do? How do you decide? How do you sort of weigh up the opportunities as well as the limitations that some countries might have in reaching these goals?
Thank you for the question. Before we came up with the proposal, there was a lot of preparatory work and mapping of the landscape and identifying the issues that the various stakeholders are facing. So we are in the era of primary use of health data, so in the era of use of data for the purposes of providing health care directly to patients. We are already building on existing activities of the eHealth network, which is for the time being a voluntary network of member states, authorities or agencies responsible for eHealth, and this collaboration is based on the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive that was adopted in 2011, and for the time being, it is a voluntary collaboration, and we see, quite some work that was achieved by the eHealth network, but in certain areas, I mean, the progress is not probably as fast as it could be, and also the number of the member states that are being currently involved or connected, for example, to the My Health at the EU cross-border infrastructure is rather limited for the time being. So there are certain limitations. And in the era of secondary use of data, so reuse of data for the purposes such as health research, health policy making, or health innovation, we identified big difficulties and challenges, for example, for the researchers when they try to use cross-border data sets for and identify them and get access to them for their project. Due to the various interpretations or implementations of the legal framework, but also different administrative practices and other obstacles. So really, I mean, from the impact assessment that we conducted before the actual proposal was drafted, the conclusion of the impact assessment was clear that we reached the point where we need to move from this sort of a voluntary type of collaboration towards something more structured, and the regulation was deemed to be the right legal instrument to bring this forward.
Thanks, Martin. Does anyone else want to come in on the mandatory angle before I move? No. You want to?
No, I was just trying to listen.
On the mandatory angle, whether it should be mandatory or voluntary, some of the aspects of the health data space. No, sure. We'll move on to what I wanted to get to next, which was trust. And Jolene, at the beginning, you were saying, you're talking about the sort of the privacy risks, and also risks about using big data sets and AI and concerns of patients. And I'm wondering, it's a really complicated thing to get patients to trust that many more people are now many more researchers, many more policymakers are going to be able to access their data when this regulation is eventually passed. How do you begin to build that trust? What's the sort of first steps that the bloc needs to take to do that?
I think there are two sides which we should look at. So first is the legislative side. We need a framework which would be clear, full of different safeguards, understandable for all parties involved. But if we speak specifically about individual side, patients, citizens, consumers, whomever you want to call, even if we are speaking about one patient group, for instance, rare disease patients, which I represent here, is that every person will have their own preferences. And even if we would ask each other now question what to do with our data, all of us will have diverse opinions, diverse things we would want to be included in that system. So the system should be flexible enough to allow for diversity of preferences. Somebody will be more privacy-minded, somebody less, but all of them should be equally protected. So the preferences should be diverse, but the protection should be high level. It's one component. Then another component of trust, we do trust something we understand. So to ensure patient trust in the system, we really must invest into education, into building not only digital literacy, but also digital health literacy specifically, because this is something else. And it will be needed when we start using the diversity of tools, sharing data for research, and so on and so forth. And it's difficult to say where do we start. To me, this should start at school, because we start speaking in our school lessons about fundamental human rights, but we never speak about digital rights. So in order to build a society which really benefits from data sharing, we need the society to understand that, and all stakeholders should understand that, not only patients, but it's also healthcare professionals, it's also researchers, it's also industry partners and policymakers. So it's a society as a whole who should raise the level up.
Your first point was on sort of diversity of preferences, and I'm wondering if you think that's something that is already within the proposal, if that's something that you think needs to be added to make that clearer, or is it already, do you see it in the language of the proposal already?
I think it could be much more specific because there are some general principles in the proposal which are already reflected. But when it comes, for instance, to secondary health data uses, we do have a bit of a legal mess for the moment because there is, of course, the general data protection regulation, which remains the same, and it's going to be the data protection Bible probably for many years to come. At the same time, despite it is the regulation, it has so many derogations when it comes to uses of data for research. And some might say it's the GDPR's fault and we need to change the law, but actually no, it's the treaties of the EU and the division of competences when it comes to healthcare and research. So each member state will still have their competences in the way how do they organize their healthcare systems and research consequently. But what we really, really need to do, and I hope our hopes for the European Health Data Space proposal is that there will be an agreement on cross-country data uses. So whenever we are speaking about cross-country exchanges, that we will have harmonized view. And this harmonized view will help to ensure the diversity of preferences, because, for instance, if we are speaking about European reference networks and the research happening for a specific condition, using the data from there, it's one environment. If we're speaking about data altruism for, I don't know, general study on health and rare disease patients are included there. It's another type of agreement we need to have. The third one, commercial use, which is sort of foreseen in the new law. It's also not very clear because it seems that there is a new basis for data processing being introduced apart from public interest. So all these factors, it's just 3 pieces of very big puzzle, and there are many more pieces. So if we manage to agree on horizontal view, how do we view exchanges between the countries, that would be already a big success, I think, for the proposal.
I saw Susanna nodding earlier. Do you want to come in on that?
No, I completely agree with you. When we talk about secondary use of data, we have to make sure that all member states benefit from this. What concerns me is this overlapping with so many legislation. There are so many horizontal legislation in this European health data space. We talk about artificial intelligence. We are not yet with the final law, but we are talking about Data Act, Data Governance Act, and also all the sectorial legislation, no? Because the medical device regulation is also implied, the in vitro regulation. So there are so much regulations that we have to make sure that we give certainty to the different member states, that it is not very complex, because now we are talking about so many bodies. Each regulation implies a new body, and we have now the data protection bodies in the member states, which have to work together with this access data body. And on top of that, we have the Artificial Intelligence Board, we have this new Health Data Space Board. So we have to make sure this regulation fits for purpose. It is not very complex. And regarding your question about trust, I completely agree what you have said.
So. Martin, can you reassure us that this is not going to lead to more fragmentation?
Yeah, absolutely, and this is actually one of the main objectives of the regulation. The legal instrument that were mentioned, GDPR, Data Governance Act, AI. I mean, those are horizontal instruments that are applying across all the sectors. The European Health Data Space is a sector-specific legal instrument or legal framework. So these other horizontal instruments are setting out certain principles but they cannot, because of their horizontal nature, provide details about how, for example, certain rights or certain principles should be exercised, should be implemented, or enforced in a particular sector. To give you a specific example, is under the GDPR there is a right to portability of data, but the GDPR will never tell us in detail, I mean, how access to electronic health data and their portability should work in the health sector. And this is where the European Health Data Space proposal will come into place with the common requirements for the electronic health record systems, with specific rights of patients with regard to their electronic health data, and certain specific principles that will be applicable in the healthcare setting. So the objective indeed is to provide more specific rules and the legal framework to overcome the current existing fragmentation.
Thanks, Martin. And I want to come to Francesco because we're talking about trust, and one of the interesting aspects of the EHDS is that it's going to, looks very likely to give industry quite a big role, and I'm sure industry is hoping for that, but I'm also wondering how you think patients can start to trust that industry is not this nefarious player that wants to steal their data and use it for horrible purposes. How can we start to how can you start to convince
it
patients?
takes here to build trust, it takes a minute to destroy it. So that's, I think, one of the principles when you start thinking about this, how do we approach it? And first of all, I think as Janssen we are discussing it, but there's also a bit of team efforts, and I have a bit of privilege of chairing an executive council for health, Digital Europe, where we are sitting together with 18 companies, so health, so healthcare and health technology. And when we're discussing this, how to approach and to review the European Health Data Space proposal and come with some recommendation. In fact, the first paper that was coming out, it was about trust. So I think everyone, there is acknowledgement that this is the more critical point when we have new tool that we can do a lot of things. And in the paper we were highlighting fundamentally 4 principles. The one principle we have to be able to explain very easily which are the benefits. Why do we do that? What is possible to what was not possible before? How it's coming to me from disease interception before to new methodology for curing cancer, whatever personalized therapies, whatever what you can do. The second is not only the education of patients that you already mentioned, but also for people operating the healthcare systems. So I think a lot of healthcare professional nurses, we don't allow to sit them in front of a black box that they don't understand and they don't see how it's operate. The third one, and that was the role of the technology, that's security alarm already. So, security by design. So when we sit with technology company, what can we do? And there are already some methodology that we are testing, like federated data network, for example, which allows some of security by design, meaning the data never leave their own position, and only an aggregate setup is make a disposal for research, and you have aggregated results without sharing patients' information. And last but not least is what we are trying to do is, I think there are spot of excellence already on national basis, on private, on public expertise, and it's also to make them available. I mean, I am in discussion a lot of time. We were sitting already in a panel discussing, making also clear which are already what we have already done well, and what we can scale at a different part. So these are mainly 4 points that were included in the paper, recognizing that trust and this difficult balance between what is possible versus how do we respect private citizens, we come up.
And Suzanne, I know you see a role for the industry in the health data space, but I know some of your colleagues in the European Parliament might not, and I'm wondering what you think those discussions are going to be like.
I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a huge consensus that we have to work on it, and it has to work in the future. So we need to engage all the stakeholders on this conversation from the beginning, and this is good that we have that kind of roundtables, and we start working with all the stakeholders, because we need to engage patients, the industry, the research, so all of them. And this is why in this board of this European Health Board, the question is if the industry should be included or no. My personal opinion is that we should benefit from the expertise of the industry, and when we discuss this in the Parliament, this is an open board that can include new members. And for me, patients should be included for sure in this board, and why not the industry? We should trust the industry as we trust the academia, and taking into account that it will not be the only body deciding. It would be someone the industry will have to hear from them, and in that case, we need to benefit from the expertise.
And Jelena, do you think patients will be happy to sit alongside, industry executives on this board?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to have a dialogue, first of all, and being included into, actually not only in that board, but I think it's also important to think about structures at the national level, which also will be established, and to involve civil societies, representatives, and also different types of stakeholders, because actually whomever is involved into the system should be able to have a say in there, because the system is not something which would magically appear with once the law is approved and appearing in Eurolex. No, it will take many years to actually build something, and it will come in stages. So there will be first stage, second, and I don't know how many. And it's important to have reflections from everybody involved, actually, and have their voice heard, because what we see, for instance, of course, every stakeholder has their own key interest, let's say, in the system. But at the same time, that key interest will not work if it would not be working for anybody else. So it's a sort of a compromise which we have to achieve, all of us, in order to have a beneficial system. So I think it's not like, industry is bad and we're good. No, not at all. It's just, it's important to have a say for all of us.
And Martin, when the Commission was coming up with the proposal and the idea for the board, did you envision that industry would be part of that?
We are not excluding that. Let's put it this way. The wording is rather open on that aspect. We are referring to the relevant stakeholders and relevant third parties, depending on the subject matters discussed by the board and their degree of sensitivity. So let's say the core members of the board, of course, will be the member states authorities. I mean, they are the key participants in the board, and then in the Commission proposal, it is left for them a little bit, to determine which specific stakeholders or other third parties should participate in the activities of the board. Of course, making sure that, for example, certain types of discussions or certain types of information cannot be shared or disclosed to third parties if the information is really sensitive. But so we are not excluding participation of any stakeholders, and the decision should be made by the board itself once it is established.
Thanks for that diplomatic response. I want to move on to one of the critical reactions that we've had to the EHDS. That's from the European Data Protection Board and the European Data Protection Supervisor. One of their key asks is for the Council and the Parliament to add a requirement to store electronic health data in the EEA. And the industry has said, that it's actually really important to not discourage data sharing outside the EU. And I'm wondering, Francesco, why could you explain why it's important to industry and for research purposes to be able to not have these strict sort of bounds on where data can be shared?
Well, first of all, and I think it was very clear during COVID that research is not a national topic anymore. I think when you are facing what we are facing, and I think the disease or rare disease, oncology, or what we are trying to solve, expertise is residing a bit everywhere in the world. And the ability to have this transfer of data, to make data available, to have this expertise, to look at clinical trials, not only in one country to address different typologies, it's fundamental. Otherwise, we will never have an approved therapy at the end. So that's, I think, in the essence of what research is today. That's, I think, you cannot speak about region in Spain, or or in Italy it's the same, it's regionalized, or you cannot speak about a single country. But it's at the end of the day, it's a global matter that we have to allow with trust, with protection, but also data transfer to be able to solve and to be able to address. I mean, it goes back also, I'm working from an IT perspective now on personalized therapies. I was part of the putting up systems for CAR-T at this point in time, the cell therapies, and we were facing interesting challenge. I mean, manufacture is not available. We are building up, as Janssen also manufacture in Europe, but at this point in time, manufacturing is in the US. A part of the virus is produced in Switzerland, and apheresis is in Germany. And we wanted just to make sure, as we speak about personalized therapies, so we engineer blood cells with a virus that recognize the cancer and activate the immune system, in order to make sure that the cell come to the right person back. We wanted just to share name and birth date of the person throughout the system, because, well, it's extremely dangerous if we put the cell to someone else. And we face incredible difficulties on the transfer of this data, and there was a lot of workers to make sure that we can do that. And I don't think it was the aim of the legislation, but was one of the effects of the legislation that was avoiding this transfer of data. I mean, when we go to personalized therapies, they are evolving. They will be available more also in Europe itself. But at this point in time, let me say state of the art, or what is possible to solve and save lives, is a global matter. And those are two examples, one in the research, one more on the personalized therapies, where we are facing and see the difficulties at the moment.
Gillian, I'm wondering, would you want to see that sort of limitation put in the proposal to not share the data sort of outside the EEA?
That's a good question, actually, and I don't have a definite answer to that, because on one hand, especially for rare disease community, the global research on rare diseases is vital, because sometimes there are only few people in one country who have a condition, and in order to have that data at all and know something about the disease, there is a need to pool the resources and to learn more. And we're not even speaking about the treatment. Sometimes it's about very, very basic things, very basic knowledge about certain conditions is missing. So we do need to share data globally in the future, perhaps, but part of me also agrees with the DPS and the DPB comment on that, because for now, it's our legal protection is perhaps not there to ensure the safe use of that data. So it's a tricky balance between the need and between the safety and protection. Simply because for the moment, we do have one of the strongest data protection frameworks in the world. And many countries, and this is exactly how GDPR functions, and this is exactly why DPS and DPV commented the way they commented, is that the standards of that with some countries is not aligned. With some, yes, and I think with those with whom we do have similar protection levels, there is an opportunity to share that data. But with the others, we still need to catch up and to think about safeguards we put in place. Because especially when we speak about conditions such as rare diseases, of course, usually it's anonymized data which is mentioned and non-personal data which is shared for that. But if we speak about genetic conditions, and many of which are rare, we cannot speak about anonymized data. It's always personal. You cannot ever anonymize genetic data. And it's not only about privacy of a person, it's also about overall lives, perhaps not only of their family, but potentially future generations. So this data is extremely sensitive. It has lots of value and it has a lot of potential for research, that data sharing, but it's really not an easy balance to find, and I think we still need to do that in the future.
We have just a couple of minutes before our in-person Q&A, and I wanted to go to something else about, talking about sensitive and valuable data. I saw one analysis, asking if the EHDS was sort of a Trojan horse for industry, and the analysis was asking whether companies might be forced to hand over valuable data sets and whether the EHDS would protect intellectual property rights. And I'm wondering, Susanna, is that something that you think is going to be discussed in NB as you negotiate this?
I think there are many open questions when we look at this regulation. It's so complex. I have to admit, it will be one of the most complex regulations we will have to deal in the Parliament and with 2 committees. But for example, we have to talk about intellectual property. This is always a huge topic in the Parliament when we talk about how to ensure or protect the intellectual property. When we talk about the clinical trials, for example, it is not clear in this regulation. We have to talk about fees. We didn't discuss this topic, how it will be the fee structure. I think it is a delegated act. It depends on the country level, but we need to harmonize this. It concerns me that for these databases in each member state, that we have enough funding, because we have to make sure that they have a structure to have the database, not only in the most rich in some countries, but in all the countries, because if not, we will have databases with biases. It is not the same if we have only databases from the north of Europe, which are highly digitalized, that if we have a common databases for Europe. So there are still a lot of topics that need to be discussed in the Parliament, and this engagement with all stakeholders, it is so needed.
Martin, do you think that industry should be worried about that aspect, or do you think that in the proposal there's sort of strong enough rules and sort of provisions in place that would protect industry's valuable data?
There are provisions indeed in the proposal. We thought about it. I mean, when we were designing the proposal, and we are trying to strike the right balance. On one hand, to make available or make possible access to the data that are needed for further enhancement of research projects, or sometimes it might be necessary data, for example, for regulatory authorities or public health authorities to make their decisions, as we saw, for example, during the times of the COVID pandemics, and so that they can have easy, timely, and at the same time secure access to those data. But at the same time, we need to make sure that the IP rights or trade secrets are sufficiently protected, and that by providing access to those data, we are not compromising the company's rights in that respect. And there are provisions to that effect in the regulation.
Thanks, Martin. Francesco, are you reassured?
I think the discussion is still to take place, but for sure the intention is there. I think it's a balancing act of a lot of things, and that's what we have to consider. But it's important that also the certainty of operation for the industry is still clear.
Mm-hmm. We're now going to move to the Q&A for the on-site audience, and I want to thank the online audience for joining us. And please don't go too far. You can go get a cup of coffee, but very shortly there's going to be a session on the pharmaceutical strategy, so stay tuned for that. And please stay seated if you're in person, and think of your questions. Maybe one of those on the sort of how much it's going to cost to access this data. That might be an interesting one if I was asking it. Thank you very much. Just one moment.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.